Welcome back, everyone, to our deep dive on diplomacy in Denmark. This is our 8th episode in this special series, and of course, it's still part of the Diplomacy in International Relations podcast by Bastian Friborg. And as always, just a quick reminder, this episode is AI-generated and fact-checked by Bastian himself.
Absolutely. So we're excited to bring you the most insightful information about diplomacy in Denmark, particularly for those of you interested in international relations and Danish politics.
All right, let's dive right in.
Sounds good.
Our sources this time really got me thinking with this idea that we are all diplomats today. It suggests that diplomacy isn't just for, those folks in suits at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Right.
But it's a much broader concept.
Yeah.
We all contribute to Denmark's image abroad, from the royal family to everyday citizens like you and me.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. It's a real shift in how we think about diplomacy these days. The world's so interconnected now, and it's not just governments calling the shots anymore.
Right.
Businesses, NGOs, even individuals on social media.
Yeah.
They all play a role. True. So that brings us to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Okay.
You might think with this everyday diplomacy thing expanding that the ministry's role would be less important.
Right.
But our sources suggest quite the opposite.
Yeah, it makes sense if you think about it. The ministry is kind of like the conductor of an orchestra,
Okay.
bringing all these different diplomatic actors together to make sure Denmark's foreign policy is cohesive and effective.
Right.
It'd be chaos without that central coordination.
Yeah, like trying to make sure everyone's playing from the same sheet music.
Exactly.
And speaking of shifting landscapes,
Mm.
the structure of Denmark's diplomatic representation, that's been in constant flux for centuries.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, our sources highlight this fascinating event back in 1824 when every single diplomatic post was reviewed because of financial constraints.
Oh, wow.
Imagine being a diplomat back then,
Yeah.
not knowing if you'd still have a job.
It's a bit unsettling,
Yeah. And that's not even mentioning events like the Battle of Divell in the 19th century.
which led to some serious cuts in the Foreign Service.
Yeah, it really shows how real-world events, even centuries ago, can directly impact diplomacy.
For sure. It makes you realize those decisions made in Copenhagen, they really have ripple effects across the globe.
Absolutely.
So we've got these kind of core elements of representation, the permanent missions to major players like the UN, the EU, Washington, D.C.
Yeah,
But the number of embassies and consulates seems much more fluid.
exactly. And looking back at the past few decades, the list of countries where Denmark has closed embassies, it's quite extensive.
Is it?
Yeah. For instance, in 2002, embassies were closed in Eritrea, Malawi, Zimbabwe, Ukraine, Argentina, Australia, and the Philippines.
Wow, that's a lot.
And then just a few years later, in 2010, more closures in Jordan, Algeria, Bosnia, and Nicaragua.
It makes you wonder, does this constant opening and closing of embassies send mixed signals to other countries?
You think so?
We'll take Algeria, for example. Embassy opens, then it's closed. Then reopen, then closed again. It's hard to build trust and lasting relationships with that level of inconsistency, don't you think?
I can see that. But of course, balancing diplomatic reach with financial realities, it's a constant struggle.
It is. Which leads us to this concept of flexible representation.
Okay.
It seems like Denmark is trying to find a way to maintain a presence without, breaking the bank.
Right. Makes sense.
So there's this idea of co-location. Apparently, Denmark is sharing embassy space with Norway in Maputo.
Interesting.
And then there are these serverless embassies where diplomats are essentially working remotely from their laptops.
Wow.
It sounds almost futuristic, doesn't it?
It does. It kind of makes you wonder, though, can you really achieve the same level of diplomatic engagement just through a screen?
Yeah.
I mean, the in-person element, building those personal relationships, that face-to-face trust, it's hard to replicate virtually.
That's a really good point. And then there's the case of the traveling ambassador in Iraq.
Yes. That was quite a unique situation. The ambassador had previous experience in Iraq, a deep understanding of the region,
Right.
pre-existing relationships, so it seemed to work. But replicating that model in other contexts
Yeah.
might be difficult. It really depended on the specific circumstances and the expertise of that individual.
So we're seeing this kind of push and pull
Mm-hmm.
between traditional diplomacy and these newer, more flexible models.
It seems that way.
But beyond just physical presence, technology itself is changing the diplomatic game. Virtual diplomacy, Twitter diplomacy.
Oh, yeah.
It's a whole new world out there.
It really is. I'm curious, what do you think about that? Do you see technology as a help or a hindrance to traditional diplomacy?
Oh, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
On one hand, it facilitates communication,
Right.
makes information sharing more efficient.
Right.
But on the other hand, it can lead to a more impersonal, almost transactional approach.
Hmm.
It's like we're at a crossroads trying to figure out how to use these new tools without losing those core values of diplomacy.
I see your point.
Uh,
And then you've got the added layer of the EU's common foreign and security policy.
Right.
How does Denmark navigate this landscape where some aspects of foreign policy are actually handled at the EU level?
yeah, it seems like a tricky balancing act between national interests and EU cooperation.
Exactly. Co-locating with EU delegations offers opportunities for coordination
Right.
and shared resources, but it also raises concerns about maintaining Danish sovereignty and representing those specific Danish interests.
So Denmark needs to make sure its voice isn't lost in the crowd, so to speak?
That's one way to put it.
Yeah.
And then there's the question of consular services.
Okay.
The EU could potentially take over some responsibilities like crisis management and disaster relief, but I imagine some countries might be hesitant to relinquish control over those areas.
Yeah, it's definitely a sensitive issue with potential political ramifications.
For sure. And speaking of new paradigms, there's this concept of the competition state that's reshaping Danish diplomacy.
Okay.
It's almost like embassies are now mini businesses with revenue targets.
Really? It's fascinating. Embassies are actively promoting Danish businesses and trying to boost exports. In 2012, they generated 77 million DKK from these activities.
Wow.
And by 2014, that number had jumped to over 100 million DKK.
It's impressive. But it also begs the question, what should be the primary focus of a Danish embassy?
Right. Is it about economics? Or is it about something more diplomatic?
That's a crucial question to consider. And while the number of diplomats hasn't drastically changed, the budgets and resources they have to work with
Yeah.
have definitely tightened.
So even if they're not being asked to do more, they're being asked to do it with less.
Precisely. And it's leading to some tough decisions. Selling ambassador residences, downsizing to smaller buildings, limiting business class travel.
Right.
These cost-saving measures might seem small, but they can have a big impact on how effectively an embassy can operate.
It's like trying to run a marathon with your shoelaces tied together,
That's a good analogy.
isn't it?
Yeah, it really is a challenge. And then when you add in those rising security costs, especially in high-risk countries, the budget constraints become even more noticeable.
Yeah. It's a lot to juggle. But stepping back a bit, I'm curious about this idea of the competition state. What does that actually mean? And how is it impacting the work of Danish diplomats?
Well, it's a shift in thinking, I guess, about the role of the state in this globalized economy. In the past, diplomacy was primarily about representing those national interests and building relationships with other countries. But now you've got this added layer of economic competition. Embassies are increasingly being tasked with promoting Danish businesses, attracting foreign investment, boosting those exports. They're almost like salespeople for Denmark Inc.
So it's not just about waving the flag and attending those fancy dinners anymore.
Nope, not at all.
They're expected to really have their fingers on the pulse of the global marketplace.
Exactly. And that requires a whole new skill set.
Yeah.
Diplomats need to be savvy about economics. They need to understand international trade,
Yeah.
be able to connect Danish companies with opportunities abroad.
It's like they're wearing two hats now, diplomat and business development executive.
Precisely. And that can create some tension.
Oh,
Well, some diplomats embrace this new role. They see it as a way to make a tangible contribution to Denmark's prosperity, but others worry that it detracts from the more traditional mission of diplomacy,
right.
that it prioritizes economic interests over those more nuanced diplomatic goals.
That's a valid concern.
Yeah.
Does focusing on economic competition risk undermining Denmark's reputation for promoting human rights and sustainable development?
Well, it's a delicate balance for sure,
Yeah.
and one that diplomats are constantly grappling with. They need to find ways to promote Danish economic interests without compromising those values that Denmark stands for.
Right. And it's not just about striking that balance globally.
Yeah.
The EU presents its own challenges and opportunities for Danish diplomacy.
Absolutely.
There's this constant push and pull between maintaining national sovereignty and working within the framework of the EU.
Yeah, that dynamic plays out in a lot of areas, including diplomatic representation.
Uh-huh.
On one hand, co-locating with EU delegations can be cost-effective,
Right.
and it allows for greater coordination on shared priorities. But it also raises these questions about whether Denmark's distinct voice and interests are getting lost.
So it's like a trade-off between efficiency and visibility.
Exactly. And it's a debate that's ongoing within the Danish foreign policy community. Some people argue that Denmark needs to assert its national identity more strongly within the EU, while others believe that a more collaborative approach is better for Denmark in the long run.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers. It seems like technology is adding yet another layer of complexity to this already intricate landscape.
Definitely.
We talked before about virtual diplomacy and Twitter diplomacy. It seems like social media has become this really crucial tool for diplomats.
Oh, for sure.
But it also presents new challenges.
Absolutely. It allows diplomats to connect directly with a wider audience,
Right.
bypassing those traditional media channels. But it also requires them to be constantly on,
Right.
to manage their online presence very carefully, and be adept at navigating the often treacherous waters of social media.
It's almost like they need a whole new skill set. The ability to craft a compelling tweet, manage those online communities, respond to criticism in a way that actually advances diplomatic goals. It's a far cry from the days of just writing those diplomatic cables and attending formal dinners.
It is indeed. It requires them to be quick on their feet, media savvy, and comfortable engaging in these public debates in real time.
So diplomacy is becoming more fast-paced, more public, more digital.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
But at its core, it's still about building those relationships, fostering understanding, and representing Denmark's interests on that world stage.
That's precisely it. And despite all the changes we've discussed,
Yeah.
those fundamental principles, they haven't changed.
Which brings us to the individuals who embody these principles, the diplomats themselves.
Okay.
What does it actually mean to be a Danish diplomat in this rapidly evolving world?
That's a great question, and one that deserves a deep dive all its own.
Absolutely. Let's explore that further. What are the unique challenges and rewards of this profession in the 21st century?
Yeah, it sounds like a fascinating career, but not one without its challenges. It's not all fancy dinners and traveling the world, is it?
Oh, definitely not. It's demanding. You need a particular set of skills and be ready to make some personal sacrifices. You're always adapting to new cultures, learning languages, building relationships with people from all walks of life.
And you're always representing Denmark, even in your personal life. That must be a lot of pressure.
It can be. You're constantly aware that your actions reflect on your country, but it's also an incredible privilege to be able to represent Denmark on the world stage, to be a voice for your country's values and its interests.
I imagine it's also pretty rewarding to actually see your work make a difference, to help build bridges between countries and cultures.
Without a doubt, there's a real sense of accomplishment when you can facilitate a successful negotiation or
Right.
help resolve a conflict or just contribute to greater understanding between nations. And speaking of building bridges, I want to circle back to this idea that we are all diplomats today. It might sound idealistic, but I think there's a lot of truth to it, don't you?
I agree completely. In this world that's so interconnected with information traveling at the speed of light, our actions have global repercussions. We all have a responsibility to be mindful of how we represent ourselves and our country.
It's like we're all part of this huge global conversation. And whether we realize it or not, we're contributing to Denmark's image abroad.
Exactly. Every interaction we have with someone from another country, every post we make on social media, every opinion we share, it all shapes the perception of Denmark.
So it's not just what diplomats do in embassies and meeting rooms. It's about how we as citizens engage with the world.
Precisely. And that's why it's so crucial to be informed, to be respectful of other cultures, and to be open to different points of view. We might not all have the official title of diplomat, but we can all be ambassadors for Denmark.
That's a powerful thought. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Danish diplomacy, I want to leave you with a question. How are you a diplomat for Denmark?
Something to think about. How do your actions, your words, your interactions with the world contribute to shaping Denmark's image and its relationships with other countries?
It's a question worth pondering, especially as we navigate this increasingly complex and interconnected world.
Absolutely. And remember, diplomacy isn't just about big gestures and high-level talks. It's about the small, everyday acts of kindness, understanding, and respect that can build bridges between people and cultures.
Thank you for joining us on this exploration of Danish diplomacy. Don't forget to check out other episodes in our Diplomacy in Denmark series, as well as Bastian Friborg's main podcast, Diplomacy and International Relations. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those diplomatic skills sharp.